All right, so to keep track of attendance, I will have each day somewhere, maybe on the back desk, there will be a copy of, I don't know if you guys can see this online. See, so it'll look like that with the dates. Just put a check mark by your name if you're here, and then I'll do it for the online one too, a separate one. So, so just make sure before you leave the classroom that you are checking the box that you are here. Can everyone hear me okay with the AC going? Is everyone okay? Can you guys hear me online? Okay. I know there's problems in one class I had. Seem to be having some technical issues here. Screen share. I need a screen share. Okay. So I promised myself I would get this book out. Described this last class about, this was the first book that they gave me for the weight training. I don't know if you guys can see it online, but it is super old and it smells wonderful. Wonderful. So this is one of the pages in that book that I described with the leg press. Over here. Oh, it's, thank goodness we devised the machine to do that for us, because that's, yeah. And there's spotters there that are helping. I can almost guarantee there were people before this that tried to do that on their own. You can see they basically use weights, just free weights for everything. There were very few machines back then. They did something similar with this with a toe raise, when they did it with leg curls, basically laying off the edge of a table and the weights were connected to their feet. It's the leg curls. Same thing with leg extensions. So there was no machines with pulleys and cables or chains or anything, just grab some weights and you did it. And you always made sure, too, to wear the shortest shorts that you could find to do these in. So, it's usually the way. And I was wrong also. I think I said the publication year for this book was 1964. It was 1962. 1962. And the school that I mentioned about decreasing the injury rate, it was actually LSU. I thought it was Harvard. I was getting mixed up with another college. Anyway, so there's a blast from the past. Everyone probably had their PF flyers on. Any questions? All right. So short review from last time. So chapter number 1, Intro to Exercise Science. Maybe. Clicker not working. So we had neat thermogenesis. we go. So we need to describe the two terms that are part of exercise science. So the first one there being exercise. So the performance of any physical activity to condition the body, to improve the health of the body, maintain fitness, or it can be used as some form of therapy or rehabilitation. Then we specifically said about define physical activity, which is basically any human movement. And sometimes describe some of that as NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That thermogenesis just means you're creating heat. Anytime we move, we're creating some form of heat that's being dissipated. As long as we're alive, we're creating heat. Exercise then is the structured form of that. And then any type of sports is either exercise or physical activity with a competitive component in with it. Questions on any of that? Anybody? Then the science side of things, the systematic attempt to try to explain any phenomenon, any observed phenomenon that is occurring, and the knowledge that's gained from those attempts. So you have a question, you have a problem, and you try to come up with a solution or an experiment to test what is actually happening, what is actually going on during that physical activity, during that exercise. Or whatever you're ingesting, so eating, drinking, injecting possibly in your body. How does that affect the body at rest during exercise? So using the scientific method to come up with a conclusion. So physical activity and exercise, knowing it is important for promotion of good health, good living, good clean living. Physical inactivity can result in early morbidity or disease development and premature mortality or death. Is that better? I don't know if it's better or not. Any questions on that? Over there? So a graph here just to show what the common forms of death are in the United States. So from 2018, heart disease, number one, it's still number one. Cancer is still number two. Both of them are far above anything else. But those two diseases have a direct correlation with physical inactivity, with poor diet, also some lifestyle habits there, smoking being the biggest one. Although smoking, I think, is on the decline, kind of. I'm not sure what's going to happen now that e-cigarettes have kind of been banned and they raised the age to 21, and you could see an increase in other substances now. Because what actually happened, this is kind of a side, my random thought of the day. Back in, I think it was the late 2000s. Well, in the 2000s, there was this big campaign to get out to high schoolers to stop smoking, and young teenagers, and even people in their early 20s to stop smoking. And it worked. It worked. People stopped smoking cigarettes. But they actually just switched to cigars and chew. The same amount of people in the same age group were using nicotine and tobacco. It was a different form. So everybody has their vice, right? I guess. So, or marijuana. We're switching to marijuana too, quite often. Now, respiratory diseases. Speaking of which, respiratory diseases, stroke, and sometimes again, stroke can be sometimes categorized in this heart disease because it's more cardiovascular related. But accidents from all causes, and then Alzheimer's disease and diabetes. Diabetes has a direct correlation with that physical inactivity as well as diet. So the responsibilities of the exercise science professional. So help individuals understand the importance of physical activity, exercise, and promoting good health, good fitness, decreasing the risk for disease. And also prevention of any injuries and any recovery from any injuries that people do suffer. So what are the best practices for each of those injuries? And then design programs, exercise, fitness programs that is based upon actual science, not just because that's what we've always done and continue to do. The science portion of that is the important part. Something that is safe as well as effective. One of those mornings, I kind of wish I could have an IV bag with me with just coffee just being injected, just dripping in my veins. It's Friday, right? Okay. So there was the assumed. So getting back into that science portion. Sport and athletic competition, important for culture and society. We touched on that a little bit. All age groups can participate. Really young kids, all the way up until we die. That could be up into early hundreds. As long as we can still move, we can still compete. So all the great sports that we have, like poker, cornhole, it's on ESPN, so it's got to be a sport. Jokes falling flat. Successful performance based upon the principles that are grounded in the exercise science. Again, the science is the important part of that. Can't do it just because we assume that it works or we assume that it is the best practice. We need to back it up by data. And that's the important part to this. I touched on talked about static stretching, somewhat at length. Probably the biggest, one of my biggest pet peeves, and I'll be honest, I see it a lot of times in higher education. I've been in it long enough where I'm like, oh my goodness. Anytime there's a policy in place, I see it in athletics too. I'll ask the question, why do we do it this way? What's the purpose? Well, that's the way we've always done it. That's the answer that I get. You gotta give me some substance. What's the reasoning? The actual reasoning. That's not a reason. That's just because if we have no data to back it up, maybe we try something else, and if that doesn't work, then at least we tried it. So, but we have to have data and some basis for why we're doing something other than, well, it's just the way we've always done it. So why change? Always try to strive for something better. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. As long as it's safe and effective. As long as it's safe and effective. Fine. Okay. So another reason why it's important from the sports aspect of it, surveys done, at least with high schoolers, from the late 80s to the early teens. We had an increase in athletic competition or participation in athletic competition in high schoolers, both males and females. Same thing on the collegiate side. Almost double the amount of athletes in college within 30 years. That's quite a bit. So needing healthcare professionals within specifically exercise science, not just personal trainers or strength and conditioning coaches, but maybe dietitians, athletic trainers is a big one, physical therapists, maybe a little bit of occupational therapy, chiropractic medicine in there as well. And then, so it is an umbrella term. Involves physical activity, exercise, a sport, competition, athletic performance. It really is characterizing anything that involves the movement of the body and the adaptations to those movements. The repetitive movements. So not just after one day of movement. It needs to be a continuous repetitive action. Maybe not every day, but most days. Or some days. Just where we left off. So the umbrella terminology, looking under this umbrella, we have exercise physiology, and we'll go over most of these fields this semester. Exercise physiology, clinical exercise physiology, biomechanics, nutrition, psychology, athletic training, and anything to deal with sports medicine, and then motor behavior. And motor learning is to be grouped into that as well. From the exercise physiology standpoint, well, from all of these, it can also branch off into other areas. Because in exercise physiology, you can have someone who is an environmental exercise physiologist, someone who is just a general exercise physiologist, cardiac exercise physiologist. So you have some specific areas that you can get into in exercise phys. We're really looking at health and the performance side of things. The clinical side, that's really looking at prevention of disease or injuries, but also rehabilitation. So it's related to athletic training, sports medicine, but it could be more of a general field where anybody is going to be there, not specific to athletes. Biomechanics, and actually there's some subsets of biomechanics also, but we're really taking the physics of the body, within the body, but also outside influences. And it's a lot of times applied to the clinical side with development of machinery to use for rehabilitation, braces, knee braces, ankle braces, but also the performance side. Making sure that equipment is safe and effective, even if it takes away from some of the performance. but also trying to improve performance at the same time, as long as the safety isn't hindered. Nutrition, exercise and health, prevention of diseases, and also the performance side of the sports. Same thing with psychology, maybe not trying to prevent a disease, but you could maybe try to prevent somebody from becoming addicted to certain substances. It's a big part of the exercise psychology field. Painkillers being a big one. Athletic training, sports medicine, prevention, and rehab. That's the main goal there. And then on the motor behavior side, that is clinical, and you're looking at some sport performance as well. Motor behavior and motor learning is really looking at how we develop essentially the connection between the brain and the muscles. What happens with that connection? How does that information get transmitted down through the spinal cord? Why do we do it? What are the processes that take place? How do we change it if need be? How do we even learn how to walk? Those are some of the questions that are asked in motor control, motor learning. And if somebody's injured, how do you get them back to normal? If someone maybe loses the ability to walk because of a traumatic injury, what are the steps you need to go through to get them to relearn to walk? Any questions? Hey, let's get into it. We've already gone over these three definitions, kind of, but we'll reiterate them real quick. Physical activity and exercise. So physical activity is activities of daily living. It includes pretty much all human movement. This is sometimes this is referred to and abbreviated ADL. Activities of daily living. So it includes anything that we do throughout the day. Walk. Excuse me. Walking to and from class, up and down the stairs. You can increase some of that physical activity by doing some things and making some choices. Parking a little bit further away from the Walmart doors. Actually returning the cart to the cart bin. Actually putting it in there. Maybe. Please. Then exercise being the structured form of that physical activity. So there's actually maybe a set time and place. There are a certain number of sets, certain number of reps, certain time that you're going to be exercising for, certain intensity that you'll be exercising at. And then sport and athletic competition is just some type of movement that is structured in nature, but it's organized so that there is some type of competitive aspect to it. So by this definition, yes, poker and cornhole are sports. So there you go. any questions on these definitions? All right. Let's move on. Let's go into a little bit of background of the field. Let's go way back. Greeks and the Romans. Some of the great philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Socrates, sometimes I refer to them as Pluto and Aristotle, but it's just a joke. They were really interested in the human body and the form of the human body, and especially the Greeks and the Romans. They were, well, we got the Olympics from ancient Greece. Made sculptures of the human form. Most of the time the human form was naked, because that's just what they liked. They were trying to figure out what was happening during physical activity or exercise. They didn't quite understand it. They didn't necessarily know exactly what was happening, what all the organs were doing, but they knew something was happening, because I'm sure people started to realize that, well, your heart was beating faster while you were exercising. Why was that? What's the purpose? We're also getting wet on top of the skin, or sweating. Why? So we had some questions. Now, even before this, humans kind of knew what we were made up of. We maybe didn't know exactly what the organs did, but for thousands of years we were killing animals and also killing other human beings and dissecting both of them and figuring out, well, okay, this bear has a heart, but we also have a heart too. This alligator has lungs, well, we also have lungs too. They're basically the same. So we're made up of the same stuff. So we could essentially study animals or other humans and dissections and figure out what we were made of. Now, we maybe didn't know exactly what was going on, how they interacted with one another, but we knew. There was a period of time, though, right around the Middle Ages, and there were some other cultures and other periods of time, where there was a decrease in the knowledge that was gained about the human body, mostly because desecration of a cadaver was a big no-no. Could not do it. But there were still underground dissections that were going on to try to figure out what was happening inside of the body. During the Renaissance period, Leonardo da Vinci also started to look at what was happening in the body, trying to figure out what the organs were doing. Now, a lot of these philosophers and inventors way back when maybe didn't know, mostly because they didn't have the techniques down pat or the technology. That's the big thing. As soon as we got the microscope, however, then things changed a little bit. Things changed all throughout the world in almost every field. Not just with humans, but also with plants. But with humans, we can actually see the tissues. And see, okay, well, the cells that make up the heart are different than the cells that make up the liver. The lungs look a lot different underneath the microscope. What is going on here? So we were able to actually see some of the tissues. Then once we get into probably the 18th-ish century, somewhere around there, 19th century, we started to figure out what was happening with blood flow, mapping out blood flow. Figure out, okay, the heart pumps the blood, the lungs, well, that's for the oxygen, but also carbon dioxide is being released that way. But where's that carbon dioxide coming from? Where's the oxygen going when it gets into the lungs? And it's hooked up to the heart, obviously. So we started to map out some of this. And then we had a publication in a famous book around this time in the 1800s, which was called Gray's Anatomy. And basically mapped out all of the human body. Basically everything. At least everything that was known at that point. Muscles, ligaments, tendons, bones, blood vessels, tissues, organs. Gray's Anatomy, the book, too, not the show, not the show. Also, that 18th century region, I guess during the Enlightenment period, we started to not only find out what blood flow was doing, but we started to figure out some calculations for blood flow. In fact, there was a famous one that becomes mightily important in exercise. Man, my drawings are getting better. I need a stylus. Okay. This equation was developed. Anyone know what these abbreviations mean? Maybe? Maybe not? Anyone ever seen this calculation? No? What do you think HR stands for? Not human resources. That's a whole different field of study. Anybody online? No?
What if I'm
Heart rate. So how many beats per minute the heart is beating? On average, just an average heart rate, 70 to 80 beats per minute, usually. A lot of people who are maybe long distance runners, aerobically conditioned, it's much, much lower most often. Sometimes in the 40s, 50 beats per minute. You know what the lowest heart rate ever recorded was? Yeah.
It's like below 50.
Oh yeah, well below 50. Zero. No. It was, the lowest resting heart rate was 27, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, it was super low. And what was weird about that, it was like this old guy, old in his 50s. He was, I think he was a cross-country runner previously, then he was training for marathons. And so, yeah, he had super, that's a really low heart rate. Like, you get into the 40s, your heart is slow. But along with that, something else is related to it. We'll see how they're related. You know what SV stands for? Stroke volume. Anyone think about maybe what stroke volume is? What do you think that would describe? I mean, what a volume of a stroke. Yeah. Yeah, it's the amount of blood. The amount of blood injected in the heart for one beat. So now we know how much blood for every beat with SV, or stroke volume, so we know how many beats. So if you multiply those two numbers together, we get the total amount of, sometimes this can look like quantity. It is cardiac output, or Q. So cardiac output is the amount of blood that is ejected from the heart each minute. This is all fine and dandy, but why is it important? This equation, in fact, this Q becomes very important in determining how much oxygen somebody is utilizing during physical activity or at rest. It's actually one of the major components of the calculation to determine that. So if you change heart rate, you change how much oxygen you get. You change stroke volume, you change how much oxygen you get. And there's actually two components to stroke volume as well. So it gets even more difficult. And we're not going to go into detail about that now. XPhys, we'll talk about it a little bit. So a very important equation in exercise science and physiology. So that was a little bit of the quote-unquote ancient history type stuff. Some recent influences. The field's, it's been around a while, but it was initially started in education. I had a chat. Yeah, you're right, Grace, I'm sorry. Yes, Q stood for cardiac. So we had some recent influences from education. The field basically started from physical education. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were physical education fields, or majors. It was mostly in the education. Actually, a lot of schools were education related. Teacher schools, essentially. But they wanted kids to be physically active, so they wanted to have physical educators. Bless you. Physical educators. Then at some point, there was a laboratory that was created. I think it started in the 30s. May have started in the 20s. It lasted about 20 some odd years. Some of the funding had got cut. That was at Harvard, the Harvard Fatigue Lab. The grandfather of pretty much every exercise science laboratory program in the country. This lab had some of the groundbreaking research done on physiology, on the heart, the lungs, all response during exercise, environmental factors on the body, so heat, humidity, the cold, hypoxia. How do we even measure how somebody brings in oxygen and takes out carbon dioxide? We knew that that's what happened, but how do we actually measure that as precisely as possible? Some of that equipment, that initial testing, was actually devised in this lab. Nutrition was also a big component of the lab. But from here, the graduates from Harvard during this time went out into the field and went out and got jobs at other colleges and started their own programs, and that's where it kind of branched off from. So even though it was, I guess, a sad time that Harvard lost that lab, at that point it really wasn't needed because there was a whole lot of other programs that were starting up and doing the same thing. In the mid-century, we had the Cross-Weber tests. Mid-last century. The Cross-Weber tests, you may or may not have done some of these in elementary school. like a certain amount of push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups. You may have done some, 50-yard dashes. I don't know. There could be other ones now, but some of the basic ones at the start were push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups. Just kind of a side note, this type of exercise now, this regular sit-up that we normally think of, someone holding your feet, you bring your whole body, the whole upper body up towards the knees, is actually starting to not be used and not be recommended anymore. Just a normal crunch is just good enough. I think it's mostly because if you look at this picture, the other lady is putting her hands behind her head, and I think a lot of people were starting to get some strains in their neck and actually causing injuries. If they do this every day or every other day, over time it can cause some issues. Plus, a crunch does this basically the same amount of activity within the muscle. Yeah. But the crossover tests were devised. So there were standards that were put in place for young children. Also around this time, some professional organizations and associations within the field started to be developed and founded. American College of Sports Medicine was one of them. The National Strength and Conditioning Association, I think was 1970s. And then from there was even other organizations that branched off from them. And some of those organizations, such as ACSM, have regional organizations as well. Whoops. Any questions? So because they published the book, they like to have their own little thing in here, which I think is important because I've talked about ACSM before as being kind of a general field or general organization within the field for sports medicine that can include anything from personal trainers, strength conditioning coaches, athletic trainers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, chiropractors, doctors, nurses, you name it, within some type of field, which physical activity is a component. So the main goal was to develop a unique blend of physical education, medicine, and physiology. Make it inclusive for a wide range of individuals in the field. But also provide public outreach. And part of that is to get information out to individuals and other people in the field and the general public. So work to shape maybe public policy, creating health initiatives for the public. So promoting some form of physical activity or diet or whatever it might be. Some maybe supporting other organizations that are helping fund physical education programs. And with this, you can also get into the politics side of it as well. In fact, there's a certification with ACSM dedicated to that. So trying to go for public health initiatives, budgeting concerns, how do you actually get it out to the public, what types of advertisement do you have? Are there any questions on this? All right. So getting research out to the public, I mean, that's really the main reason why you do it. Most often, again, I described it to, if it's just to get a piece of paper or a degree, then that's kind of the important part there. But if it's important research, if it's important enough, it needs to get out to the public somehow, some way. So, and that's what their job is. But most organizations, that's what they strive to do. They'll have their own publications. So preparation for exercise science. Obviously, an intro to exercise science is usually part of the program. Anatomy and physiology. The basis for it all. The anatomy portion, knowing where the parts are, what the parts are of the body. That describes the anatomy. The physiology describes how do those parts work? How do the organs work, and how do they work in conjunction with one another? How do they affect one another? So knowing where they are and how they work and how they interact, that's the important stuff. Some other biological or basic biological sciences, and some of that's kind of related back to the anatomy portion of it, but biological sciences. Chemistry. Now, you don't need to be a chemistry major or take an exuberant amount of chemistry classes, but maybe one or two, just to get a basis. Unless you're going into a field of the science in which you're going to be doing a lot of chemical assays, you may or may not need a few more classes in chemistry. Biochemistry is an important component. Tell me what biochemistry is. Well, what's chemistry? Chemistry is the study of matter. So biochemistry is the study of things that matter, which is living things. All matter is important, but the biochemistry specifically studies about the living chemistry within our bodies. Metabolism, most often, is what we're describing there. Very, very important component of exercise science. Human development in psychology, so developing from early on in life till death, basically. How the mind works, how it affects the body, how it affects performance. Any conditions of the mind that are bad for us, and how does that affect our health, and maybe performance in sports and athletics. A little bit of math and statistics. A lot of this has to do with it. If you go into the research side of things, knowing how to formulate, create a method of collecting data and then analyzing it, but also reading it, having at least some basis of math and statistics is going to help you interpret the literature within the field. Because if you look at a peer-reviewed scientific study that's been published, it goes into a section that says results. And some of it is talking specifically about the statistics, and some of it can get a little bit, well, lack of a better term, boring. Even if you know the statistics, it's just numbers and start doing a bunch of abbreviations for the statistical analyses that they ran. Yeah, it's all digits. Then the physics side of things. Physics becomes important in the biomechanical portion of the field. So the physics within the body, but also the physics outside of the body that influences how our bodies move and react. But also in physical therapy. What types of devices are going to be used, but maybe also invented to help somebody in rehabilitation? How's it going to work? How's it going to affect the body? Just to describe the differences here between graduate and professional programs. Graduate programs, there's, so you complete degree requirements for a graduate program of study. You don't, to get into a graduate program, a general graduate program, you don't generally need a lot of specific classes that are dedicated within the field. Maybe a couple. But even then, sometimes you can make them up your first year in that graduate school. So for instance, when I was in grad school, I had a classmate, his major was chemistry, so he didn't take any exercise science courses in undergrad or grad school, because he was going to a PhD program, and he already had his master's in chemistry. But he had to take a couple classes to catch up. And it was fun because he was an absolute genius, so he was still top of the class. But you can make some of those up, usually. The professional schools, like physical therapy, occupational therapy, chiropractic medicine, they tend to have prerequisite requirements that you need in undergrad. Absolutely need. Most of the time, you can't just make those up your first semester there, because there's a bunch of them. Then the certification, any licensure that you need, just as long as you meet any eligibility requirements. If you need to have a degree in hand, if you need to be a senior level undergraduate, then employment, then you got internships, paid, non-paid internships, hopefully leading to full-time employment within the field. Hopefully. Other careers, med school, dental school. I know some people that have gone to medical schools, been full-on doctors, starting off in exercise science. We've actually had a recent graduate who is plans on going to dental school. I had quite a few go to chiropractic school. And then physician assistant is also popular. And the two big ones that we see often, physical therapy and occupational therapy. So both professional type of schools, which we will end up, a couple years, we'll have our own OT program. I mean, we do now, but it'll be up and running here with actual students shortly. And from this, you could probably start to include athletic training into that as well. So there's a certain set of requirements that you need for the graduate program for athletic training. But most exercise science programs will have those in them. Which is one of the main reasons why this program exists, because we needed something to get to that Masters of AT. Questions? And I'd like to follow this chapter up by just saying what you do, what do healthcare professionals do. You get to pose for pictures and act like you're happy. in a hospital, clinical setting, and then also massage people's feet. No, so any type of therapy. Somebody needs to go there. Excuse me. My goodness. So that was it for chapter 1. Okay, real quick. I have the sign-in sheet for you guys here face to face. If you want to go ahead and sign that. Also on Blackboard, you should have week 1 available to you, and it actually includes this PowerPoint. Probably won't do that most often. Most of the time I'm going to have parts of the PowerPoint maybe, but quiz 1 will be available probably this afternoon. Likely be up and available for you to take until Tuesday or Wednesday. And then, yeah, that'll be it. We'll start chapter 3 on Monday. So, any questions from online? Anything? You guys have anything? All right. If I don't see you, have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Everybody.